for coming out on a cold night on those for our June meeting of the Melbourne EV Group. We're going to talk about home battery storage and that tonight on those. So Dominic's come along and those. He's going to talk about some of the new ideas he's done with the chemistry of lead acid batteries and those, and then I'll talk a little bit about building one out of laptop batteries, which is starting to become popular if you look at YouTube and that these days. And a number of people in that are doing it. But we'll have a bit of news first. I'll try that one. No. With a home power system, and when you have a home battery and that on your solar system, there's a lot more different ideas that you can do. You now have battery storage and that on your home solar. So this is a little video on those about selling it back into the grid.
The world is changing, getting smarter, cleaner. All power to that. At Reposit, we're excited about the future of electricity because now you have a battery. You can choose to be an active participant in the electricity system. With the knowledge and freedom to choose how you use your electricity, how best to buy electricity, and how to get a fair price even when you choose to sell the electricity you've captured. And choosing to sell it back to the grid is important. As we add more clean energy sources to the grid, there can be gaps in generation. Right now, energy companies buy from dirty power stations to fill the gaps. You can use your home to sell them clean electricity instead. Put simply, Reposit produces software and control boxes for your home energy system. Think of it like a brain that ensures your solar, appliances and batteries work together efficiently and effectively, which gives you the freedom to maximize your energy self-reliance and use as little from the grid as possible. Reposit has developed specialized software to understand your electricity usage patterns, gather weather predictions, and monitor wholesale market opportunities. Software that performs optimization calculations 24 hours in advance, determining how much electricity you'll make, how much electricity you'll need, and preparing your system for price spike opportunities. So, if you're new to solar power, or you've already got a system in place, check out our website or talk to us. Reposit already works with a large variety of solar and battery systems. Let's find an arrangement that makes sense for you. Then, come rain, hail, or glorious sunshine, you'll always have the energy to enjoy the day.
So what the Reposit Power System does is it's software to work with your home power system and Energy or one of the other companies so that you can sell your power into the grid on those. So you'll be able to take advantages of spot prices on those when the price peaks. The battery system would then be able to sell energy into the grid on those and you pay a higher rate than that for it. And also planning of your solar system, like how much power you're going to need tomorrow, and those maybe you might have to draw some off-peak power overnight to top up your battery overnight because the sun's not shining, and you can get that power cheaper off-peak at night. So this is some of the software that is designed for connected solar systems, so that to make the solar system more efficient and more smart on those, especially if it has a battery storage on it. Well, in Western Australia, on those, the system that I'm showing there is shown on Catalyst. No, sorry, it's shown on Gardening Australia, which is Josh Byrne on those, who has a sustainable house in Perth. So you'd have to explore to see if it was available in Victoria. If it was, it'd probably be Diamond Energy. On those would be the company that would offer you feed-in tariffs or, you know, spot prices access to the national electricity market on those for it. So you'd have to look into that. The other news that's coming up, of course, is Pikes Peak is coming up again. It'll be on, I think, this weekend. It's on in the next few days. And I had a look on the website to see who was competing in it this year. And in the electric division, we've got Entropy Racing EVS. That was a car that was raced last year. The second one I don't know. Oh, Rice Millen. Yeah, Rice Millen, he actually won the electric section last year. And Jijima with team with the Japanese EVEP, the Japanese team. To meet you here, he's going to be in it again this year on those. He's using the technology from Rimac Automobili, which is based in Croatia, and they've also produced a new car as well. So they had the Concept 1, and this one's now called the Concept S. So they're also updating their technology. And also this year, for the first time, we've got an electric production car on those. So it's a Tesla S 90D, the dual motor 90D. So it's the first time that a Tesla has gone into the Pikes Peak race. So it should be interesting to watch. I don't know whether it's available live on any of the news channels or anything, but I think that's on this weekend. It's in Colorado. It's in America. So it's a hill climb event on those climbing up to 14,000 feet. It's probably the best known hill climb event in the world. So it's their 100th anniversary, and that this year of the Pikes Peak hill climb. So I'd be interested to see in the news with this car here, Tamage's car. I know that they've changed the tyres on it, revised the braking, changed the aerodynamics on it. So they've done quite a bit of work on the car since last year on those, and I remember it came second last year on those. Both the electric cars had breakdowns. They had faults, and that occurred in the cars during the race, and neither of them, were going at full speed on those of what they were capable of. Though I think they still came first and second. I remember
wow.
One of the cars was running on one transaxle because it actually had a front and rear drive, and one of the motor systems failed, so it was only running on one axle. And the other one had a brake failure, major brake failure. The mechanical brakes actually failed on it. And beg your pardon?
It was going up.
Probably not on this race. He said no. He came second. The guy whose brakes failed. So it'll be interesting to see what happens this year. Okay, that's a bit for some EV news. So tonight, I've asked Dominic to come along to talk about some of the work that he's done with lead-acid batteries and with the electrolyte technology. So I'll move to Dominic now.
Thanks, Paul. Okay, hello guys. So Dominic Hawkins is my name. Sylph is my first name, but people can't pronounce it, so Dominic is fine. And as Paul just briefly mentioned, did everyone hear me up the back? Yep. As Paul briefly mentioned, one of the things that I've been doing recently is getting around to present workshops and hands-on workshops and theoretical workshops on some of my research into alternative electrolytes for lead-acid batteries. So Paul and I know each other through working on electric vehicle, sort of on a retail rev bikes, and looking at lithium phosphate builds, NMC, NCA, different forms of lithium-ion battery setup, and that's all great. And they're still new produced cells, we'll be honest, from China. And while that's a fascinating area, especially for in terms of weight to energy density for weight to watt hours per kilo for electric cars, electric bikes, things like that, helicopters, quads, a whole other area in terms of home storage where lead acid has been the let's face it, it's the key battery for the last 150 years since Paton first invented it in France. And it has some fundamental flaws to it that mean that it's becoming less and less a viable long-term storage battery, while the price of lithium-ion and things like nickel ferrous are coming down to meet it in the price point. So what I was always interested in was specifically to help people, say in Permaculture Melbourne, Permaculture Australia groups, off-grid, DIY sort of homemakers and homebrew people, be able to take lead acid batteries that are already scrap or second-hand batteries from landfill or from waste streams and rejuvenate them, de-sulphate them, put them back into use. As well as that, being able to look at what are the key issues for lead acid that causes it to have such a small lifespan and number of total life cycle count, and how can that be shifted and changed so that you could put power back into the hands of an individual. So I don't know about you, but I'm a fan of homebrew DIYing, and the ability to sort of take a battery apart and rejuvenate it back together for another 10 years is fascinating. It fascinates me. And I'm certainly looking into not only energy sort of, independence in terms of self-reliance, but I'm a big fan of microgrid ideas so that a local community group should be able to support themselves, build up an energy storage system, a microgrid system, and don't necessarily need to spend $50,000 on a battery setup for it, if that makes sense. So a lot of this work started a few years ago visiting friends with the tiny house movement that I'm sure you guys are well aware of. And over dinner with them, I thought it was brilliantly ironic that they told me they'd spent $7,000 building their entire house on the trailer and then spent $25,000 purchasing the battery system for it. And I thought that was really weird. Like brand new, if they were looking for low energy density ratios, that would have been fine. But for what their purposes were, they didn't know how to clean up or rejuvenate lead acid batteries. So a whole lot of work over the last 10 years and a lot of work in the wind and solar off-grid sector, and myself and lots of friends who run a few different consulting companies. Been looking into what is the key issue. So quick hands up to get my head around where people are at. Hands up anyone who's worked with lead acid batteries or has lead acid, like an off-grid setup. One, yep, a few. Anyone who's worked with lead acids, say, over more than the last decade, like 20, 30 years, remembers them from the 80s? Yep, cool. And what about anyone who sort of has a chemistry background, or regardless of even like introductory or advanced? Great, wonderful. Okay, so I'll try to condense like a 10-hour talk into 20 minutes and see how I go. I'll flick through this in just a sec, but to give you a very brief overview, are there any markers, pen markers? Is this the black one here that I can use? Yep. Shoo. Is it possible to get the screen off that? Awesome, thank you. Okay, so we'll condense this very quickly. So the traditional lead acid chemistry, just to get everyone's head around, and what Plant discovered, he was the French chemist who worked this out originally by accident, but good on him, is that we've got two plates, a negative and a positive. I'll call it negatrode and positrode, just for clarity, rather than anode and cathode. So anyone who uses the anode and cathode mentality, just bear with me. Negatrode and positrode. And this is in an aqueous solution. Any better pens? Do we know? Oh, actually, you know what? I have brought some in my bag. I have a red one. Do you mind passing my little pouch? Oh, the other one, the green one. Yep. Thank you. I come with my own pens. Check it out. That's right. Done this before. That's right. No, didn't bring black. Oh, that's better. Okay. So, as everyone's probably aware, we've got an aqueous solution of sulfuric acid. So this H2SO4, and I'm just going to, don't worry if some of the figures go over your head, you'll get the rough. I'm just trying to pitch it to a different couple of levels. This has a concentration of approximately 5 mole concentration. That's very concentrated, by the way. You know, instant blindness, that kind of thing. So not something to be having fun, just casually messing around with. It would equate to like an approximately 40% weight to weight for sulfuric acid compared to the water it would be dissolved in. We've got a positive plate and a negative plate. To start off with, they're both lead. So for people who remember batteries from 1980s, sort of 70s to 80s, the batteries that you remember then, do you even remember if they came in clear acrylic cases? Any flashback to that? Yeah. Any wonder why that doesn't happen anymore? Because the companies make them so terribly poor that they don't want you to see the degradation of plates. So what happens is you've got two lead plates, and upon the forming charge, the initial charge, the positive plate, the positrode, gains an oxide layer called lead dioxide. And it actually takes a very long time to do this, so it's quite an inefficient original process. That's why they have a little cheat. They now paste the lead dioxide onto a grid of lead. That's why you've read pasted plates in modern lead-acid batteries. But the negative stays as lead, and the positive becomes lead dioxide. And they're floating in this solution. So during the charge process, you end up, ideally, at the end with these two pieces. What happens during discharge, and where we get most of our voltage from, is that on the positive, the lead, make sure that I copy this directly from my notes so you can read this later on. So the lead gathers some hydrogen, which it gets during electrolysis. When you charge the battery, there's hydrogen available. It forms sulfuric acid. The hydrogen is actually, this is a lie. This is actually more like this. It's kind of a very close bond of hydrogen and something called bisulfate. And so this shoots off and decides to form water with the positive electrode. This little guy loops together with more of these sulfate plus electrons that it gains from the negative pole. The discharge goes like this. And this whole thing gives us a very fascinating little piece. The final discharge reaction, we form something called lead sulfate, which is very important, and I'll talk about that in just a sec. And hence, this is the fundamental, what this whole paper is about, basically, and what I'm going to talk about tonight as to how we can fix this issue. We form lead sulfate and water. On the negative, the lead bonds with, let me go back to my other notes. With the bisulfate itself to form lead sulfate plus more of the hydrogen. So during the discharge, both the positive and negative plates become sulfated. They form this white crystal compound. Has anyone, hands up if anyone's ever seen, let's say, the inside of a battery or the clear acrylic cases, there's this very obvious white crystal buildup. And unfortunately, I wasn't set up enough to bring some test batteries to show you, so it'll all be theory. But if you can picture in your head this kind of color of the lead itself, you know, and the lead dioxide is like a very, very dark chocolate brown kind of color. And during discharge, they both form lead sulfate, which is this, almost like this, a white metallic-y compound, which is insoluble, highly insoluble, almost as insoluble as radium sulfate and calcium sulfate, which is plaster of Paris, if you can get your head around how much that's not going to dissolve, if anyone's made clay. And what happens is during the next recharge process, theoretically, this sulfate will bond with hydrogen that's formed at the negative, because the hydrogen appears, because it splits the water into oxygen and hydrogen. The hydrogen appears, it's meant to grab the sulfate off the plate and reform the bisulfate anion. And then on the positrode, the oxygen displaces the sulfate, has a higher reactivity. So what you find is that in very old batteries, or sulfated batteries, like most car batteries after 3 or 4 years, if you were to take them apart, the positive, the positrode, is actually very clean. It still looks like that chocolate brown color. And it almost doesn't have any evidence of this white sulfate crystal, because it gets effectively pulled off from the oxygen in the charge process. The negative just keeps building and building and building until it starts to, it's much thicker, yeah, than the lead, and it's a layer. So it starts to bulge. So, and you've seen bulging batteries, you see where the sides pop out. So the sulfate, there's all these plates very thinly put together with little separators, and the sulfate builds up and up and up and pushes them out, breaks the separators and can short between plates, and then pushes and bulges the plastic of the case itself. So you get all this mechanical damage and so on and so forth. So for anyone who has worked with lead-acid battery or has an off-grid house, as those of you put your hand up before, anyone want to give me the standard depth of discharge that you're usually allowed to take lead-acid to? So if you were to set up, say, an off-grid house or even like even a caravan, what would the depth of discharge be? Yep, yep. Yeah, so 50% is like best case scenario, and that would be for ideally tubular wound, spiral wound, deep cycle, batteries. So 30% depth of discharge is the standard for plate batteries in an aqueous solution. So for car batteries, for an off-grid house battery, 30% is the total amount of power you can pull per time before the next charge cycle in order to get your lifespan out of it. So just to give you, which is crazy, especially when you compare to lithium, we're looking at like a 90% depth of discharge. You know, you're like, That's why, I mean, I've got an electric trike. You know, I ride around, and I've got a 2 kilowatt, 48 volt battery that's about this big. It's insane. You know, it's almost unimaginable from having worked on lead acid for so long. But in terms of being able to build, say, off-grid houses or caravans or stationary applications, I'm not too worried about the weight. If we can fix some of these problems chemically, there's a world of incredibly cheap lead acid batteries. People can't even give them away, you know, these days. The Australian recycling scheme for lead acid is pretty well formed, and they estimate about 98% of all batteries that go through the scheme are recycled, you know, up to 99%. Standard kind of figures from independent researchers show that it's more like 60 to 70% of all batteries in Australia even make it to the recycling scheme. They either sit in garages for decades on end, or they get dumped on the side of the road. India and Africa and those kinds of countries who don't have the infrastructure have a massively lower recycling rate, you know, like 3 to 5% for India. And friends of mine who do humanitarian work overseas send back, one of them sent me a photo, Tim Webster is his name. He sent a photo of a little village that they were working in, and down at the river was just lead acid batteries upturned into the river because they'd stopped working. You know, they'd just been, the charge regulator had failed over sort of like a 10-year period on a little remote power build. No one really knew what to do with them. There's no recycling. So they just got dumped in the river, which was like terrifying, you know, to think about. Downstream to drinking water and farms and that kind of thing. So I set about from a number of angles to look at this problem. And given the enormous distribution infrastructure of lead acid around the world, like ridiculous, yeah? Think of every internal combustion engine that exists. Let's say that 99% of them use a lead acid battery as a starter. And you think of the sheer number of lead acid batteries and distribution chains that must exist worldwide to make that possible. It's insane. So if we could shift that and change that, we've already got a massive system in place. Nothing new has to be built, yeah? So in terms of a brand new battery, if you were to buy a brand new lead acid battery, anyone give me an idea for the warranty you would get for a brand new car battery? 2 years. Yeah, you get 12 months for commercial use, 6 months for taxi use if you read the little, which is funny. 1 year, if you pay, you know, your $120 for a good RACV battery, you get 2.5 years. Yeah, that's right. So in terms of warranty, they're made to fail, and there's 3 key reasons that they fail. One is one that we can fix. The other 2 are mechanical faults and problems that can be fixed, but not chemically. So in terms of if you were to buy a brand new battery, a car battery, and you expect your 2.5 to 3 years from it, if at that point you were to, let's say you're very smart and you buy a cap battery, not a rubbish sealed battery. I'll get into that later on. You can ask me more questions about the calcium silver alloy at the tea room later if you want. If you were to dump out all the liquid, store it, neutralize it, take it off to your service station, here's a tub of sulfuric acid for you, and you were to fill it up with Epsom salts, with magnesium sulfate, maximum concentrations, about 1.3 mole, 1.6 mole, I think, you would find that you would have a slightly lower overall voltage, less cranking power, but your battery would last for about 7 to 10 years on average. If you had sized a battery that was still able to crank your car over, you know, so you're used to a little 50 amp battery, you buy your 70 amp one, you put your magnesium sulfate in and it still works. So I was really interested. Has anyone read anything on, say, Google about Epsom salts rejuvenating lead acid batteries? Anyone come across this before? Yeah, a little bit before. Yep. Sodium sulfate being used. Come across that one? with fresh sulfuric. Yeah. Yeah.
No.
Oh, with sodium. Yeah. Or magnesium sulfate. Mm.
What about overcharging?
Yeah, well, that's an option. So what I know that I'm trying to compress a random amount of information into one point. We're going to funnel towards something, bear with me. So let's say that, just to go back to this, during this discharge reaction, what we end up getting is on both these plates, we get this sulfate buildup called lead sulfate. It's an insulator, so it actually stops electrical conductivity between the plates. So therefore, there's no more, let's say that this portion of the plate is now cut off from the electrolyte, and amp hour is directly proportional to the plate surface area. So if you've halved your surface area, you halve your output of your battery, as everyone's seen, you know, like you have your old starter battery and it goes through winter and then you try to crank and the voltage is fine, but every time you turn your key, it just drops really quickly, like it can't deliver the amp output. What happens is that this sulfate builds up on the negative and it never goes back into the solution. So according to the spec sheets that you read, they make wild figures like 50 to 60% is returned, which is, I don't know where they get those figures from. It's more like 20 to 10% that I've observed. So the depth of discharge, the 30%, it's called DOD, the maximum amount that you're allowed to drop, to take out of the battery each cycle before charge. That figure, they couple up with their life cycle. So, you know, you buy your 2.5-year car battery, you buy your 7-year off-grid deep cycle battery. If you really have money, you buy your tubular wound 15-year deep cycle batteries, you know, from SRLA or like Optima, those kinds of companies. The life cycle, the number of 100, 700, 400 cycles means they've determined if you were to take the battery down by 30% each charge cycle, how long would it take before you completely sulfated the entire negatrode? At which point, or let's say, they say up to 80%, you know. So of 80% of the negatrode is sulfated and you'll get 20% of your total output. That's how they get that figure. So when you buy a lead acid battery, and if they tell you, oh, it's got 700 life cycles, you can be like, right, so that means that after 700 times of dropping down this amount, this plate will be basically white, and I'll have to bring the battery back to you, which you'll take, by the way, for free, and then you'll sell me another one. Very smart. Anyone, where we said before about the 50% depth of discharge, anyone care to hedge some ideas? If you've got your deep cycle battery, anyone bought a deep cycle battery? Caravan, camping, anything like that? Yeah? Yeah.
For yachting application.
Totally. AGM, gel, and flooded valve regulators. So there's 4 different types. They all suffer from the same sulfation issue, but the AGM and the gel have a slightly different way of maintaining sulfate in the compound, so they can increase their life cycle and reducing shedding and corrosion. But I'll talk about that later. So you've got let's say you buy your $150 deep cycle battery, yeah? And it comes with a 7-year lifespan at 30% depth of discharge. Anyone care to head, just to guess, if you were to decide to take that to 50% depth of discharge, casually, you know, each day, any idea how much it would reduce your life cycle by? How many years of life you might expect out of your 7-year battery? Oh, it's slightly better than that. It halves it. On average, every 20% drop of DOD will halve the lifespan remaining, which is insane, yeah? So any single time that you drop to that 50%, you halve the total amount because the sulfate builds up and is very hard to dissolve back in at such a high acid concentration. So from looking at this years ago, I stepped back and I thought, well, the obvious problem is the sulfate buildup. You know, it seemed kind of obvious to me that if either it wasn't forming the lead sulfate to begin with, or there was something in the battery that was more active than the lead that could strip the sulfate off the lead, you'd solve the problem, surely. There's 2 other key problems. One's called corrosion, which is kind of a misnomer. What they mean is that when they make these pasted batteries, they take just a lead grid, kind of like a mesh, And in a factory, they pre-make lead dioxide as a powder, and they literally just paste it and dry it onto these grids, these lead grids. And then what happens is, slowly during charging, the charge voltage actually kind of kicks the lead dioxide off, away, and you can watch that. It's a sludge at the bottom of the battery. Eventually, if it tunnels a little hole into the lead of the grid, it starts converting the grid itself to lead dioxide. The grid corrodes and the whole plate disintegrates. So that's called corrosion. That builds up at the bottom of the battery. And if anyone remembers batteries from the 80s, smart battery manufacturers built cases where the plates had like an inch of gap at the bottom of the battery. And after 20 years of constant use, a friend of mine showed me a photo that there was about this much, like about half of that was this powdered lead dioxide paste falling. A standard car battery that you'll buy, you'd be very lucky if you could find more than 1 mil of gap at the bottom of that. Totally. Well, what happens, because the lead dioxide is conductive, as it builds up, it shorts out plates, and then your battery's fine, but it drops to 10 volts, and you don't understand why it's still running a light bulb. If you still short it out, you'll jump 5 meters into the air, but it can't start your crank over anymore. So then you buy another one. So there's all these very kind of planned obsolescent tricks, to cause the degradation of lead acid, which is sad, because it could be a very, not that I think that it's a particularly environmentally sound option at all, but given the distribution network and the infrastructure currently, I think that it could be a very good contender for off-grid homes, especially given that the price of it, if you were to buy new, is still the cheapest rechargeable battery type in watt-hour per capacity. And if you're able to find a source of second-hand batteries, which anyone can, Telstra can't even give them away. The Melbourne Water Board, Yarra Water, they have them all for their water monitoring systems. They've got policy that they have to be replaced every 12 months. So if you know the right people, you can just get them shipped to your door, like 1,000 amp 2-volt cells at a piece, for free. They'll pay you to take them, $5 a battery. They have to pay to have them removed. So it's a really interesting kind of thing. Like on one side, you've got this off-grid market and this battery market that's powering ahead with new technology and new lithium, and new materials. And then on the other end, you've got old rechargeable chemistries, the nickel-ion chemistries, the alkaline chemistries from, I forget the name of the chemist who invented them before Edison stole it. You've got alkaline and sulfate-based rechargeable chemistries that have been around for like 120, 150 years that could work really well. So short of everyone going into manufacturing your own batteries with the best possible plate gap and all that kind of stuff, one of the solutions for this, like I said, is either to stop the sulfate from forming in the first place, or to insert something into the battery chemistry that is going to be so active that it steals that away from the lead. So let me fly through. This is a very big PDF. I ended up just quickly going to Officeworks to print 5 copies as well if anyone wants. But give me your email and I'm happy to send you a copy. Just want to show you some of this chemistry. Okay, so I know it's only on one screen, sorry. But what you're kind of looking at is some theoretical equations for, can you guys see around the corner? Yep. For if we were to take Epsom salts, so Paul mentioned that he's heard of Epsom salt being used. It's quite a thing. You can just Google and you'll see pages and YouTube clips of people saying, rejuvenate lead acid batteries with Epsom salts, and the YouTube clips are quite funny because generally it's people saying, so here's the really definite concentrations. You want to take kind of approximately about this much and that, and you do it, and then you shake it 5 times and you clap your hands and it works really well for about a month. And then it doesn't work anymore, and then they throw out the battery and get a new one, and it was a really good experiment. That's basically like the end of the YouTube clips. And I looked and searched, I couldn't find any information of like database for university testing or lab testing for different sulfates. Talking to friends who are, I'm not a chemist, talking to friends, I've never been to uni, talking to friends who are like chemistry lecturers and PhD students in different forms of electrochem, And no one could come up with a database for me. And I thought, surely this has been done. Yeah, like if it was invented 150 years ago, surely someone's thought of using a different sulfate electrolyte than sulfuric acid. Surely, you know, like we can't have missed that by that much. So since I couldn't find one, I decided to make one instead. And to start off with, to answer some of the Epsom salt YouTube clips and chit chats, if we were to look at a battery that's been used already and it's got some forms of lead sulfate on the negative electrode, and also it's in a discharge state, so it has it on the positive, and we were to just empty out the liquid and refill it with Epsom salts, you know, just go to Woolworths, buy some magnesium sulfate, mix it up in water, don't even bother with distilled water, you know, that's an awesome, it's a fascinating myth, but the majority of the microparticles in the water that are going to plate onto the lead is kind of negligible. I wouldn't waste my money buying distilled water, especially if it's an old battery, yeah? So just to put in your head, if you wanted to do this experiment, just use tap water, filtered water if you could get it, and Epsom salts. It'll cost you about $2, you know? You were to pour out all the sulfuric acid and refill only with Epsom salts. During charge, you'll end up with hydrogen being formed at the negative electrode because it's electrolyzing the water. You'll end up with electrons being pushed into the negative from your charger or whatever. And what happens is in the presence, this is my theory, it's called the bisulfate theory, and it's the closest that I've been able to work out how it could be desulfating the battery, which is fascinating to watch. If you could get your hands on an acrylic case battery, I'll show you some photos of some later, you can actually watch the negative plate clean up from this color to this color in a matter of about a week. It's fascinating to watch. And it starts, conveniently, as the chemistry kind of tells us, it starts at the negative and it kind of webs out across towards the sections that are most far away from the bus bar. So the magnesium is so much more reactive than the lead, like uptimes so in terms of standard potential, that any time that the magnesium is available in ionic form, and is floating around some compound that lead has formed, the magnesium will steal this partner away from the lead. So the lead gets left lonely and it ends up forming lead as a solid again. It takes the electrons from the magnesium. The magnesium strips away whatever is attached to it. And in this case, if we could somehow theoretically get just pure liquid magnesium into the battery, it would just strip the sulfate away from the lead and you would clean the lead and you'd have magnesium sulfate. But since I can't do that, I don't know how to, I haven't got enough magnesium or a furnace, you know, and that would be insane. So an alternative is, well, we use a common ingredient that I figure even like every village in China would be able to grab, Africa. It's a very simple compound, you know, to be able to get in large quantities, non-toxic. What happens is, at over a certain voltage, the magnesium will be forced away from the sulfate. And in the presence of hydrogen, very important, this guy is really important. In the presence of hydrogen, it grabs both the sulfates and the hydrogen and forms something called magnesium bisulfate. And it's really incredible. You can start off testing the pH of this battery that you've just done. You go down to your garage and you've got a battery from 10 years ago. And, you know, it's like what we described. It's kind of got 11 or 12 volts across the terminals, but the minute you put a load on it, it just sags. So if you were to take that, dump out the sulfuric into a tub, neutralize it, and then you were to fill it with your magnesium sulfate, Epsom salts, and if you took a pH reading of that, a little litmus paper test, you'd find that it would be about 6.5 or 7 pH. So it's neutral, effectively. Over a week, if you were to test that again, not only does the amps of your battery increase, it'll start cranking over your engine and your tractor, etc., but the pH of the liquid starts to decrease towards 1.5. It starts exhibiting this hydrogen that it can grab. So you can watch this process actually occur. It's really, really cool. On the positive, the lead sulfate, which is going to become lead dioxide anyway, and the magnesium is not attracted to the positive pole. It's a positive charged ion, so it doesn't really take place over here. This just goes through its normal reaction. Lead sulfate joins with water. It's split. It has electrons taken away from it. The oxygen that's being bubbled up in the liquid through the electrolysis, forms lead dioxide on the plate, and you end up reforming this HSO4, which bonds with more magnesium later on. So effectively what happens is over weeks and slowly and slowly and slowly, it strips all this lead sulfate crystal away from the plates, effectively the negative plate, and forms this magnesium bisulfate compound. This fascinating sort of stuff, which you can find data sheets for. And sodium bisulfate, they sell at Bunnings, you know, as a pool acid for lowering pH. So, you know, if you weren't too worried, you could take this out and do something else with it, but I wouldn't recommend it. So you would have effectively, over a couple of weeks, stripped this lead sulfate problem away from the negatron, and you've cleaned the plates. It's fascinating. In the tea room, ask me, I'm happy to show you some photos I've got on the iPad of different plates during different stages of cleaning. You go back to a battery that's like as if it was new off the press. So that the negative plates, especially because they're made relatively thick, and the sulfate layer is only surface, it builds on the surface. If you imagine that you've got this lead plate, and let's say that it's even like 0.5 mil thick, and you've got this lead sulfate crystal that builds right on the outer layer, like microns, yeah? Even if it took sort of 0.1 mil off in total, you're still left with 0.4 mil of actual lead that's sitting underneath the plate. That's just as fresh as the day it came out of the factory. Nothing's happened to it, you know, it hasn't gone anywhere. If you can take that sulfate layer away, magically you get access to that lead again. And if you go back to that little chit chat we had about how the life cycles, they equate the life cycles to the buildup of the lead sulfate over time, you would find that all of a sudden, if you were able to strip all the lead sulfate off all the negative plates, and you'd say you had a battery that had a 700 cycle life, I'd expect that you'd be back to another 600 new cycles on top of that, you know? The thing that would finally kind of kill the battery in the end would be this shedding of active material on the positive. And depending on the amount of space you have at the bottom, it would eventually short out the plates. Ironically though, while you dump out the sulfuric acid, you end up washing out a whole bunch of that with it. And that's why it's important to take that to a chemical hazard place, can't stress that enough, to deal with that. So does anyone have any questions so far about that specific kind of chemistry? Or you can get your head around how we've got these lead plates and we've got them in this, and we've got them in this solution of very concentrated acid. And what's occurring is that slowly, as it charges up, the acid doesn't change, but as it discharges, all the hydrogen comes out of the acid. That's why we're using an acid. We need the hydrogen to form water with the oxygen. Otherwise, nothing would happen. Put tap water in a brand new battery with lead plates, charge it up, you don't get any discharge. There's no discharge reaction, you know? So we need the hydrogen in some form for this reaction. As it discharges, it starts to grow these sulfate crystals on the negative plate. And let's say you only do like, just a few. So for the first month, you've just kind of got a few little bits of sulfate crystals. And then, has anyone ever grown crystals? How they grow from a seed, from the string? Once you've got one, it seeds. So it seeds sort of in a fractal geometric pattern. So it'll start growing from that one. So maybe after a year, you know, you've lost, I don't know, maybe like 5% of the total plate area. And remember that it doesn't have to be all the plates either. For some quick electrical theory, let's say 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. You've got your 6-cell battery, because lead acid's only 2 volt per cell. That's its, well, standard reduction. Oh, even my own things aren't working. And so in your car battery, it's actually, the 2 terminals are a bit of a misnomer, you know. What it actually is runs down into 1 cell, and then the next cell, next one, positive to negative, positive to negative, positive to negative. And when you do this, when you have batteries in series like this, the voltage increases, so it adds 2 plus 2, etc. So you get 12 volts. But the amperage stays the same, the current stays the same. So it's Ohm's law theory. And what that means is that the available amps will be equal to the lowest common denominator. So you could have a 100 amp 2 volt cell here and a 10 amp 2 volt cell there, and the maximum amount of draw that you will get is 12 volt 10 amp, regardless of it. So you can see how even if you had sulfate buildup on one negative plate, or one cell group rather, there's many plates per cell group, you've compromised the amp hour rating of the entire pack. And so the other cells could be perfect, but they start to dwindle away with you, and they don't get proper charge. And anyone who works with batteries, you know, that when they get out of balance from each other, it's all over. You know, the cells start to kill each other off in a way. You know, so with this process, is everyone with me up to the point where you've got lead sulfate build-up going on? The more you discharge it, the more that occurs. So if you were to discharge at 100%, you'd take your 7-year battery to about a 6-month life cycle at best. If you really bought a good one, you know, that's how hectic and fast the buildup is. And the two choices would be to either stop the sulfate buildup or insert something into the chemistry that could kind of steal it away or change that. Some people, again, if you do Google searching for rejuvenating batteries, people come up with all kinds of ideas. They use sodium hydroxide and like potassium hydroxide, thinking that it will neutralize the acid, and they don't quite understand what it is they're trying to neutralize. And they end up just unfortunately reducing the lead dioxide in the hydroxide to lead as well. They don't really form what they want. So there's a lot of ideas that have been tried along this, but for some reason I couldn't find any central database of what happens if you ran lead batteries on different sulfates. And there's heaps. There's so many different sulfate forms that you could try. And magnesium's just one example. I'll jump down here. So this is just some this is a short, tiny list. This is like, there's a lot more than this. Yeah, going through the sulfates, and we don't have to use sulfate, you could use phosphates. Like it became very apparent to me that in an industry that has worked with lead acid for such a long period of time, there is a massive gaping hole of research into alternative electrolytes that could be used. And I think that the poor chemistry is being left behind for dead, which is fine in terms of like it's pretty crappy in terms of watt-hour energy density for, you know, watt-hours per kilo. So it's not like I'm going to strap lead acids to my electric bike. I don't want to strap 100 amp hour lead acids and try to go down the street, you know. But in terms of houses or caravans, things like that, even your car battery, imagine only having to buy a car battery once a decade. I mean, on all counts, yeah? So looking at even just the list of sulfate options, the list is really large. There's a whole bunch of sulfates that are going to be usable, some that aren't usable. We obviously have to use liquid, like we need it to be an aqueous solution, liquid solution. So we can't use plaster of Paris. We can't use radium sulfate, which we wouldn't want to anyway. Part of the purpose is to look at something that could be produced to increase our health, like try to reduce the toxic death to us all. So barium sulfate's a no-go, mercury sulfate's a no-go, things like that. The list starts to cut down pretty quick to the possible environmentally benign or advantageous sulfates. But there's heaps. There's like lithium sulfate, which is really interesting. Aluminium sulfate, one of my favorite ones, although less favorable because of its environmental toxicity, but it does really cool stuff chemically, which I'll talk about. Iron sulfate, nickel sulfate, not so good. Zinc sulfate is really interesting. There's a patent in the 1960s from a guy who invented a lead acid. He just discovered lead acid with zinc sulfate, like a 10% sulfuric acid, 90% zinc sulfate. Found that he formed a whole new battery that worked in a totally different way. And the guy died. The patent was bought by Exide Corp. Yes. And we never heard of that one again. So no surprising there. But just going through the list, there's like months, years of research. Sulfates, phosphates, nitrates. There's all different compound forms that could be possibly used. They do different things. They have different properties. So on one hand, I was interested in saying, well, where is all this research and why isn't it done? And if it is done in little bits, how can we pull it all together into a centralized system because the common person doesn't seem to know, you know. You hear about Epsom salts and that's about it. If you really go digging, you hear about sodium sulfate, and then that's you'll never find anything beyond that. Some people, alum, John Bedini, who's a sort of engineering physicist, sort of electrophysicist in the States, suddenly came up realizing he could just use alum, which is potassium aluminium sulfate. It's used for preserving food. I wouldn't eat it. I don't want to intake aluminium, but you get the idea. All of a sudden, same as like the zinc sulfate battery. Oh, he invented a brand new battery. We didn't, really, if you get what I mean. Like, it's just the work that we should have been doing the last 150 years. Slowly, and then there's a cult following of like, no, it only works if you stand on your head 5 times and you do a cartwheel on the 5th moon of the month. And so people have all kinds of weird results with it. And I wanted to go through and find out, well, if it seems so simple, and if all the resources are like massively readily available, what could possibly account for the enormous difference in test results? And then started looking into solubility, molar concentration, the stripping power of certain compounds. So, for example, potassium sulfate sucks. Terrible. Terrible as a stripping ability. Like its total amount, maybe you can see here, it has almost one of the lowest total amounts of sulfate that could be stripped per liter based on the maximum solubility that you could actually fit in the battery, compared to something like if we use sodium sulfate, and these are all just per liter, so doing the same amount of work, got 131 grams per liter of sulfate could be stripped theoretically off the negative plate. And earlier in the PDF, I make some constants. So in order to calculate theoretically how much sulfate could we have to strip, if we took the worst case scenario and you were to go to, you found a battery on the side of the road, or you had one in the garage that had been there for 20 years, and it's entirely possible, because it self-discharges, that every single negative plate is white. Yeah, that's possible. That's a total possibility. I've seen those. We could theorize the maximum amount of sulfate in grams per liter that could be in the battery based on the concentration of sulfuric acid. And I won't go too far into that at the moment, but it's on the PDF. And then we can look at, well, what are our options in terms of stripping that? And already you can see why people get such success with magnesium sulfate in comparison to potassium and even sodium. But these are just one level of factors. There's so many other factors. Aluminium has one of the highest. Alum, quite low. Zinc is really up there, but it's a totally different process. So this was just a small chart that looked at solubility levels, just to start to show people that there's all this data that should be mined, that people could be working on, you know, try to get anyone who is kind of thought about this or working on this at home, you know, to share data and kind of input like a bit of a central database and build some systems. Because I have seen, and I firmly believe that very large off-grid battery backup systems could be built from scrap lead-acid batteries that have reached the end of their life. Not really. Reached the end of their current usable life in this electrolyte, and they're just being pilfed. A friend of mine who runs an off-grid, in fact, this is one of the best contacts I ever made. He runs a company called Aztec Wind and Solar. Aaron Rennie, a friend of mine who installs off-grid and grid connect solar and wind turbines, domestic and off-grid, etc. He says that on average, every year he does about 4 or 5 complete battery replacement sets for off-grid customers out in the country who bought batteries 10 or 15 years ago, and now they're at the end of their serviceable life. They're getting 50 to 40% of their total capacity now. They don't know what to do with them, so they just buy a new set. And he says on average for those houses, it costs them between $35,000 to $45,000. That's the removal cost of him to come and take the batteries away, the purchase cost of the new batteries, the installation, and then all the kind of labor, you know, back and forth. I thought, wow, like that's great for his business. Sucks for the people. I mean, you know, and so he's ironically helping me, even though it could terribly pull the bottom out of his business. But all those batteries, he basically gets $5 per battery from metal recyclers, regardless of amp hour size. So it's not even weighed by lead weight, you know? Imagine if they weighed it. Like lead is very expensive. in terms of recycling, you take a bit of lead flashing, you can get a lot of money out of that. Imagine if they weighed your 1,000-amp battery, you'd be chicking out $100 notes at a time, but they don't. They give you $5. And Exide and Yuasa, it's a Chinese battery company, they own the recycling systems, you know, so they get all those products back for $5 basically. And I think for a battery system that would have cost them maybe 25 grand 10 years ago, to get $5 per battery is ridiculous, laughable, yeah? And that even lithium, looking at life cycles, I do a lot of work. I have a different paper on reducing the flammability risk for lithium and a charge voltage regime. And looking at lithium's kind of, you know, NMC cells, 700 to 1,000 cycle life setup, you're still averaging about 5 to 7 years at less than 1C discharge rates. And on your electric bike, you'd be lucky if you were getting 5 years out of your nickel manganese cobalt lithium ion cell. So I kept thinking, like, all of these new technologies, their total lifespan is still really small, and it really still traps us into a kind of very expensive cycle of purchasing and repurchasing. And no doubt, I'm sure that we'll have lithium recycling centers set up in the same way, because they realize that they can sell you the batteries for a lot of money and then recycle them for $1 a piece, and they make a fortune. And you're trapped in endlessly buying lithium batteries or endlessly buying lead acid. And I wanted to fix that. So theoretically, I've not been doing this for 30 to 40 years, so I don't have that kind of data, you know, unfortunately. I'm only 30 now. I don't have the data of battery experimenting like that going back. But on current observation of how much it cleans up the cells and the test cells and examples, and given the kind of 10-year lifespans that the clients got of those before I got my hands on them, I don't see why you couldn't have a lead acid battery set that couldn't go for decades, you know, 20, 30 years. If you can just solve this problem, and you've got a very awesomely built contingency into the engineering, lead acid batteries should be able to survive for decades, not years. So this PDF and all of my workshops have been about taking people through the actual process, because everyone's terrified. And talk about it theoretically, it's great. When you get people out on a farm doing it, like we did a tiny house battery rejuvenation workshop. We got about maybe 40 people, and I was quite impressed. You know, a lot of people who'd never even serviced their own car battery or exchanged it before. People, like especially young people who'd never even changed a tire. And they were out in rubber nitrile gloves, you know, and goggles and masks and overalls, dumping battery acid out into tubs and neutralizing and mixing up. And I thought it was really empowering, just to help show people that you don't need to be a chemist to do some of this. There are some obvious health concerns and safety protocols that need to be adhered to, but it's not rocket science, you know, for want of a better word. There are a couple of extra things that I've discovered, caveats, but what I was interested in is, like, after we've stripped all this sulfate away and we've formed this bisulfate, which I've moved on from now, this magnesium bisulfate in that example, I thought maybe, wouldn't it be awesome if the very compound that we've created could now just be left in there and act as the new hydrogen donor, you know, in the kind of process. And I found that for some compounds that is the case, and for some compounds it's not. I don't understand yet why. And I assume it could be to do with different charge voltages, like where they separate and compound at different charge rates. I'm still exploring that. But I have found that, and all the work in the PDF, almost any sulfate compound that you could get off the shelves, and garden stores are a gold mine of sulfates. Zinc sulfate, manganese sulfate, Paton manganese sulfate, magnesium sulfate, potassium sulfates, potassium aluminium sulfate. It's really interesting. They have them all for raising, you know, mineral levels in soil. You can get them really cheap, and almost any sulfate compound will desulfate the batteries. Not all the sulfate compounds will then allow you to actually use it as a proper battery, you know, to get all your amp hour back out of it. But even then, if you were to dump that bisulfate back out and just refill it with new sulfuric acid, you're still theoretically back to your 7 to 10 year life cycle again. So there's some options, and I'm still exploring more. What I'd like to come up with is like 1 or 2 quintessential compounds that I could present as a complete closed loop process that both does all the stripping, the desulfating, and acts as the hydrogen donor, as the acid for the future use of the battery, so that it'd be like a do once, forget about it, never have to think about it again, just top water up once a year. But I'm not quite up to that point yet. But I do get around and present this because a lot of people have heard of it, or they've never heard of it, or they've heard of it and they've read that it was a sham and they've just written it off and just go on to kind of not thinking that it's a viable option. So, yes. Yep. Well, the oldest one that I've got currently going was a 1.5 years ago on a 100 amp deep cycle 12 volt, pretty standard crappy battery from the Lion Corp, which is pretty crap. It was found on the side of the road and I thought, great, donor battery. Of 100 amp, I was able to get back to about 80 to 85 amp hour capacity out of it. And I assume that maybe it's through like degradation of the plates that I've lost that last 15%. But so far, after 1.5 years, it's not particularly showing any signs of, it's just showing as if it was giving that 85 amp hour new again, as if it was an 85 amp hour battery. So, but it's only 1.5 years of data. Hopefully in 10 years I could answer that question better. Yeah.
One of the things I've heard thank you. One of the things I've heard about batteries, AGM batteries in particular, is you can do a process called equalization where you put in 16 to 20 volts for 8 hours, and then hopefully it doesn't smoke too much. Does it work or not?
It does. It does. So the reason that it works, and I could answer that quickly, go to my other notes. The reason that equalization works is because there is a potential, there's a standard potential voltage for this lead sulfate. So it's saying that over a certain charge voltage, this compound will, and the lead from this compound will be more willing to separate and become solid lead again. So to give you an idea, this at the moment, if we were to break that into its little, if we were to look at it on a much smaller scale, we're actually looking at lead in a 2+ state. So it's given away 2 electrons and it's kind of hungry for 2 more. Bonds with sulfate, which has 2 extra electrons that it's needing to do something with. So they marry up and they have a great old time. And this lead is still, it's still lead, it's still just waiting there. At over 2.6 volts across this cell, the lead, and that I won't explain it now, but that's just the total of 2 half-cell equations. So you look at what the voltage would be for the lead going from, I know this is not quite the answer to the question, lead going from lead solid to an ionic form, and then the reverse occurring on the positrode, which is actually from lead 2+ to lead 4+, tetravalent lead minus 2 electrons. So they give you a total voltage of 2.4 volts, which ironically, if anyone who knows lead acid, is the charging voltage per cell. That gives you 14.4 volts for a 12-volt battery. If you go over that, you start to get into the territory towards this 2.6 volt limit, where this lead is more willing to separate from the sulfate and take the electrons and just become solid again. And so lithium utilizes this in the chemistry. It's very interesting. And come on. But while it does work for reducing the sulfate on the negative, unfortunately it has a negative effect on the positive. That's a really weird sentence to have said. Once you start getting over about 2.4, 2.45 volts, the extra voltage actually bursts off and kicks off particles of the lead dioxide from the positive, which is really weird when you look at it. And at first, because I've had fun, I was like, oh, well, battery, we'll just crack it up. I've put 52 volts into a single 2-volt cell at times, coming straight off solar, just putting solar through to be like, let's look at all the different options for desulfation, let's look at what happens. And yeah, it totally strips sulfate off the negative in random patchy ways. It ignites the hydrogen that's generated as well. That's terrifying. So you get these awesome, if you do it at night, the bottom of the battery keeps lighting up. and you get these great sonic booms, because I clear acrylic batteries, so I don't recommend that. But the positive, literally, you can hear it popping, and it like explodes. So, and you can watch these little chocolate brown powders burst into the liquid solution, and then expose either they force that off the grid alloy and they start to weaken the grid, and then they expose the grid to the sulfation, like to the electrolyte, or I imagine that they kind of take with them other chunks of the dioxide. So the equalization charge theory, it totally works for reducing sulfation. If anyone doesn't know what he's talking about, sometimes on chargers, and you see it like even on solar regulators, they'll have something called de-sulfation or equalization. And what they mean is that for a short burst of time, for like 3 to 5 hours, they will allow, generally it's about 15, my pens are running out, 15.4 volts across the total. Anyone want to quickly divide that by 6 and calculate what that would be per cell? 2.57? So way above this threshold. They do that for about 5 or 6 hours in an attempt to kind of push up the cells that are doing poorly because of sulfate buildup. It does a lot of heating damage. The heating warps. The lead melts at a very low temperature, you remember? So the heating literally warps the lead and the separators, and a lot of weird stuff occurs. Doing it on and off every now and then is probably not terribly, like, once a year for 5 hours would be fine. I totally wouldn't recommend it as an ongoing solution. There are a whole other realm of thinking for battery desulfation, which is called pulse desulfation. Anyone ever heard of the Pulse Tech desulfators? Yep. Do you guys know how they work, or? Yeah. What they've done, there's 2 different types. It's really ironic when you look on eBay. The cheaper ones are just a DC pulse, and they just take back the charge voltage. They simply amplify it up in a boost circuit, like a Minty Boost kind of style, and they just pulse it back at around about a 10 kilohertz rate. They found that a group called Pulse Tech in America in the 90s were commissioned, is that the right word, by the American military to fix their battery problems, because they have lead acid batteries in who knows how much stuff worldwide, and imagine the cost of maintenance for them. So it was worth them to fund a couple of $1 million for this small company of 3 guys who were sort of like electrophysicists and also sort of electricians. They realized that if they could vibrate the plates literally, like on a mechanical kind of level through DC and AC pulses at between 10 kilohertz and 15 kilohertz rates, the sulfate, like it's at about between 10 to 12 kilohertz that the sulfate crystal resonates. So it would become more ionically available in the liquid, and then it would bond with the hydrogen desulfate. And they're awesome. If anyone doesn't have one and you have lead batteries, I highly recommend buying one. They're amazing. They need to be left permanently on the battery. They do desulfate, and then they continue to give out their pulses, but they need to be permanently left attached. They do suffer if you ever have, with inverters that are having some really weird sort of back EMF sine wave stuff going on with the batteries, they suffer from voltage spikes and frequency on the DC line. So sometimes they die, and they are not cheap. But I thought an ultimate solution would be to combine, if you had the money, you'd buy a pulse desulfator, combine it with an electrolyte change, desulfate them back, and then take off your pulse converter, and you don't need to buy one for every battery. You've got it then, and it will no longer sulfate over that time. But there are a few avenues, for this. Even the Pulse Tech guys who have invented the desulfating pulse technology, they kind of claim it on their website. I think it's pulsetech.org is their website. They claim an increase of up to 5 times the life cycle of the battery just using the pulse desulfator. It's like, wow, pretty crazy. Yeah. Yep. Yep. Yeah. Yep. 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 Yeah. Oh yeah, the hydrogen gassing, the bubbling. Yeah. Yep. which is important because you need the hydrogen that's generated from the trickle charge to grab onto the sulfate that's been released from the plate. Yeah. 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 You do. I'll sell you a new battery. Yeah, totally. That's great. So ironically, the batteries you probably got from the Sovos were almost brand new. Yeah, that's right. Ah, that's great. That's exciting. What kind of era? What kind of era were you doing that during? Yeah, yeah. And did you ever get into any of the pulse desulfating? Yeah. Yeah. Ah, fascinating. People hear there's lots of different wise tales about different forms of battery desulfation. You know, there's a school of thought that's like higher voltage. There's a school of thought that says higher amperage. And so there's people with welders welding across terminals. And there's people like myself, you know, attaching 100, 200 volt solar banks to individual cells. And they all just do different things, you know, like it's just about charge potential. But effectively, all of us, or everyone around the world who's trying to deal with this problem is just trying to deal with this little guy here. So I thought, wow, why don't we just get rid of him? Just get rid of it. Just kick it out of the way. One of the issues is that, at least as far as my chemistry understanding goes, I have not found a replacement electrolyte yet. If anyone knows one, please let me know, which would provide hydrogen to the same degree without any compound that's attached that would bond with the lead. No? No one put their hand up. Okay. So, like if, let's say theoretically, and this is actually an invention, if you could come up with a liquid hydrogen in the battery, it would just run practically forever, yeah? The only thing that would be left would be, well, not even the kind of acid corrosion on the positron. So as long as the voltage was stabilized, theoretically that would just be, in a perfect world, back and forward and back and forward. Who knows how many tens of hundreds of thousands of life cycles, yeah? But in real world scenarios, and I don't have supercoolers to make that happen, there are other acids, you know, hydrogen. People get a lot of success with phosphoric acid, orthophosphoric acid, H3PO4, which you can get from brewery shops. You know, they sell it as like a sanitizer. You have to make sure you get like 99%. Sometimes it's mixed in with soaps and stuff, and that's just, you don't want to do that. Poor little battery. But there are other people who've explored this, but to my knowledge, there's no one who's compiled it all together that I can find and sort of interested in coming up with something that could be a really actually valuable change in the chemistry, either to desulfate batteries from landfill or from waste stream so that people could build off-grid systems practically for free, or just to put them in brand new batteries, you know, get your brand new battery, buy it from RACV, dump out all your sulfate, your hydrogen sulfate. It's probably already sat on the shelf for 6 years anyway, but, you know, hypothetically. Fill it with a sulfate solution. You know, aluminium sulfate works the best, highest voltage output, charge voltage, and just drive off. If anyone's interested, you can come and see the starter batteries of my diesel van are laundry powder, sodium sulfate, rocking. I keep a voltmeter on the dash and I watch it. And the only times I've ever had problems, because I just drilled through, it was a valve regulated battery, yeah? So you just drill through the caps in the top, dump out the liquid, wash it a few times, try to get all of this sludge of the dioxide out. Refill it just with sodium sulfate, like laundry detergent powder, basically. And it's been great. I've been driving around for about a year. The only times that it's not worked is when because I haven't plugged the lids, I haven't plugged the tops, I'll do lots of, I live in off-grid, dirt roads, you know, and it sloshes liquid out of the cells. And I'll find that one of the cells is down and the plates are exposed. So I literally just found that if I just fill it back up, I can just get in and crank the engine and drive off. And I think that's great. Like those batteries were from 2007 as it was. And I don't see why they would stop working in any short amount of time, you know. Anyone, friends of mine or people come to the workshops, one guy just couldn't, like he kept writing on the Facebook page because he had this, like an Audi or something. It came with the stock battery that it had since 2009 and he loved it and he'd taken all the care and he, you know, trickle charged every time that anything happened to it. You know, his son left the door open for 5 hours, so he trickle charged the battery, you know, he's like, was really onto it. And after this time, it was dying and he had to jumpstart the car to get it to the workshop. We were up at Yarra Junction doing a tiny house build. So we converted a 24 volt, 600 amp hour set to sodium sulfate. And we had all this sodium sulfate left over. and everyone else had left. And so it was just him, myself, and the tiny house owner and a couple of other people. And I said, well, why don't you just, you know, if everyone wants, like, go and get your car battery. We've already got tubs of there's tubs of lead floating in sulfuric acid we have to deal with anyway. What's an extra car battery to it, you know? So we did. He went and he got it. We drilled into it, and you know, the liters of black sludge that came out. No wonder it was starting to drop down in voltage. Was pretty impressive. But anyway, we watched it. He held out no hope. He was quite a skeptic on it. We filled it back up. It cranked over straight away because you got to think, like, what causes the ability for the discharge reaction is both for the lead dioxide to be on the positive plate and therefore to be hydrogen in the liquid somewhere available to form water and allow this electron transfer process. So it must have just worked out to our favor that because he'd driven it 6 hours before, there was still sulfuric acid on the negative plate embedded in it, like kind of intercalated to the lead, enough that hydrogen could cause it to start. You know, I didn't think it was going to start without a charge. Anyway, he started, he drove off, and then he wrote me a message that night saying, hey, I can't believe it. Like, I turned the car off, I turned it back on, I went to the shops, I turned it off. A week later, it's still going. You never had to trickle charge it. And so he just went on, you know, he jumped up like another 10 people for the next workshop, which was great. I haven't heard from him since, so I assume it's still working fine. That was September last year. That's right, that's right. But yeah, I haven't heard from him, so that's good news. But yeah, that's right. No news is good news. Yes?
When you clean the battery out, what do you do with them?
Yeah, yeah.
How do you neutralize them?
Awesome question. So because we've been doing this on a larger scale, like workshops and just to paint you guys a picture, I'm aware I'm over my 15 minutes now, yeah? Okay, yeah, we could all be dead. Because we were doing large off-grid changes, so just to paint a picture, the 24 volt, 600 amp set that we did for this workshop, sort of the batteries would be about half the total, like half the length of this table and about as high in tubs, tubular wound, and it was about 82 liters of electrolyte poured out that we had to replace. So we had these massive tubs. So what we did was we took all, like, we had I got big blue, you know, those kind of chemical barrels you can get with the lockable lids, the big 120 liter ones, IPC barrel, with lots of goggles, lots of gloves, lots of masks, you know, if possible, a full gas, like, you know, respirator. But we're doing big scale. Keep dumping all of the used sulfuric acid out, and all the lead particles come out with it. Because lead is insoluble in the acid, or to the point of, like, I think its solubility is 0.00012 grams per liter. So it's relatively negligible. Over time, after like an hour or two, all the lead settles to the bottom of the tub, and you get just this crystal clear kind of, it's no longer 5 mol because most of that's gone, most of that sulfate's gone onto the plate. But it tested to be about 2.5 to 3 mol acid. So then what we did was we got another tub, and we ended up getting lots of cotton sheets. I was thinking, how can we filter this in a way that's like, can't just use a little coffee filter. We've got like 80 liters, you know, it's like, wow. So we ended up getting about 3 layers of old cotton sheets that he just had lying around, you know. And we basically just fit them into the tub as a massive filter, put on the lock ring, cut a hole in the lid, put the lock ring on so it wasn't going anywhere, poured all this through, and it was perfect. We caught all the lead as an actual paste, you know, in the cotton sheets. Haven't neutralized it yet, you know? And then in the tub was just the sulfuric. We did that twice, so we double filtered it. In the last one, there was no trace of the lead particle that we could see. And then we were able to sort of tie up the lead. That went into a bucket that went straight to the heavy metal recycling place. So they take lead acid batteries. Turns out they take lead in a bucket as well, which is great. And they weigh it. Yeah, even better, you get more money back. It's a lot of process. Yeah. That was good. Yeah, that's what it was ironic. The guy just looked at me. Don't ask, don't ask. But so then now that we had this tub of 2.5 to 3 moles sulfuric, I simply took a titration. Like I made up, I just had bicarb on me. So I just took 1 mil of the total electrolyte volume in this sulfuric tub and titrated 1 ml of 0.1 mole bicarb. Worked out my titration amount. You could look up titration online to Google to work out, to understand how that works, but it gives you a total amount of neutralizing reagent that you would need. So you know exactly how much bicarb, for example, you need. So if, say, you worked out, okay, with the concentration and the volume of acid we have, I need to go to Woolworths and I need to buy 15 kilos of bicarb. This is a lot of battery acid, by the way. You could do it with caustic soda and it would be like, you could do it with like a liter of, it would be quite impressive, but something that's cheap and readily available, you could neutralize it with bicarb, and effectively what you just form then is sodium sulfate, which is ironic because that's exactly the thing that we were putting in the battery to start with, but to a relatively unknown concentration. So you neutralize it, the hydrogen forms water, the sodium comes out of the bicarb to bond with the sulfate, and it forms sodium sulfate plus carbon dioxide plus water is the total neutralization reaction. After we pH tested that to a pH of about 7, then it was poured into the toilet drains, like the toilet system that was attached to the Melbourne water, the sewage system. So that was how we dealt with that particular one. In terms of if you had like a fully off-grid property and you didn't have access to mains water or sewage, you could theoretically neutralize this and just pour it on the ground, but you'd want to really make sure that you'd filtered 5-6 times, to really clear out any lead particles that would be left through paper filters and things like that.
Yeah, I got another question. How do you clean out the gel battery?
What? Oh, the gel battery.
Yeah.
I have not been able to. So this is all working on wet lead acid. So either it's called flooded lead, which is like capped with the screw caps, or valve regulated lead acid, which is basically lead acid that either has calcium or antimony or silver in an alloy to reduce the oxygen and hydrogen gassing. And then it's not really sealed, that's a lie. It's just that there's no caps, but there are small vents, rubber vent holes in the battery. So those batteries are all wet, liquid filled, and that's what I'm basing this on. The AGM, the absorbed glass mat, can be rejuvenated because all it is a fiberglass separator which holds the sulfuric acid. So I have found that if you literally tip the battery upside down and leave it overnight, just the sheer gravity will sort of displace the, not displace is the wrong word, it will draw out the remaining liquid from the AGM sheet, and then you can just top it up or fill it with your sulfate solution. The gel batteries, I have not even started on. I know that some of the gels they use are like petroleum polymers, but I don't understand how to change that chemistry yet. So if you try it out, let me know. So what would happen to the battery? Yep. So what we ended up doing for one of the case studies, because what I wanted to do was start gathering data for this. So I ended up doing case studies for lots of off-grid rejuvenations, and they send me voltage data and amp hour discharge rates every month and C rates, because I wanted to build longer-term data than just my own experiments. So with one of them, we decided, well, let's have a look at what happens if we were to desulfate it. So it had aluminium sulfate, a combination of aluminium and magnesium sulfate, which there was a purpose for that, but it didn't work out, so whatever. That was just run on a kind of deep discharge and charge from solar for 6 months. And then that was all, there was a second workshop, we poured all that out, and we wanted to replace it with sulfuric acid again. So what we did was, when we had the initial rejuvenation workshop, and we tipped out the first batch of the battery acid, again, we filtered out all the lead particles. We kept this, that one was like a smaller battery, it was about 55 litres of electrolyte. So we had this tub on his property, big death face on them, like, definitely don't open this. And once we came back for the second workshop, we simply we simply dropped we kind of let the lid off that to evaporate down to a concentration that we wanted, and that allowed us to fill up all but one of the cells. And then we went to Battery World to get some sulfuric at 5 mol to fill the last cell. So we were able to just reuse that. If you had a source of greater concentration sulfuric, you could definitely just mix out your concentrations in water and get back. But the average, the standard average is about 5 mol. They vary between 4.5 and 6. Because ironically, since the hydrogen is, the grams of hydrogen that are available in the liquid is directly proportional to the amount of oxygen that it can displace off the positive. So if you have a very weak acid, and you say you've got, let's say you've got 1 gram of hydrogen per liter available to strip, and I'd have that I can calculate, but the grams of oxygen I can't even calculate. This is hypothetically say 50 grams of oxygen on the plate, you know. That's made up. No one quote me on that gram of oxygen. I haven't weighed the oxygen on the plate. You can see how there's just not enough hydrogen in the liquid available to do anything more than strip 1 gram of, or not even that, half, 0.5 gram, you know, into H2O. So if you can increase the concentration of the acid, technically you start to increase the amp hour rating. Some cool experiments, if you want to do, if you're having fun, are to dump out your battery acid of your 100 amp battery, your deep cycle, refill it with 18 mol sulfuric acid, and draw 350 amp hours out of your 100 amp battery. But it'll be dead in about a week. Like, the rate of sulfation is so, especially at that, like at 18 mol, would be so excessive that it just would just disintegrate, you know. And then conversely, you could have a lower concentration of sulfuric acid, and you'd extend the lifespan of your battery, but you'd have compromised, instead of 100 amps, it might only give you 50 amps, something like that. So there's a whole, sort of, like, there's so many little areas to this that I, for one, would love to see a lot more centralized databasing and information about. I think it would be awesome to be able to go to a battery shop, and on the shelf, you buy your batteries by your metal sulfate that you're interested in the properties. You know? You can be like, oh, I'll have a magnesium sulfate battery today, and aluminium sulfate. They have different properties. Like that chart that I showed before with the solubility and molarity data, where we were looking at 61 grams of potassium, 131 grams of sodium, etc., 300 grams of aluminium. They all do different things, and I don't have a slide for this, but just to give you a bit of a picture, I'm sure you'll all be able to see this, if I can find it again. The different sulfates, the different metals, have different characteristics, and they allow different things to occur. So sodium sulfate, I have found, is the fastest to charge. Like, it takes charge immensely quickly. I can go from a completely flat starter battery, and I have 2 in parallel. I can go from a flat starter battery that won't crank my 2.5 litre diesel engine at all, and I can give it 1 jump start, immediately turn the engine off, and crank it ongoingly, again and again and again, from the same charge. Really weird. It's fascinating, you know? And I think, so there's something going on with the sodium in how it's attracted through electrostatic forces that is different from the actual plate reaction. And I'm still exploring that. But that's basically how lithium works. The lithium, hopefully, doesn't necessarily form a compound with either electrode, but it just gets moved and held in polarity near the anode, and then discharges back in. So it'd be interesting if you find out that a similar process was actually occurring. And maybe it's going to take me too long to find this drawing I was trying to show you, but magnesium sulfate sort of tends to give me like approximately 70 to 80% of the amp hour capacity of the original battery. And it's an average charge, you know, kind of similar to sulfuric acid. Aluminium sulfate can give me almost 3 times the discharge, the instantaneous discharge amps, which is fascinating. So cold cranking amps, you know, hey, there's an answer to that. Don't have to increase the acid concentration. For whatever way, I don't understand how it is that the aluminium interacts in that process to allow that to occur. Maybe just through greater, like a less resistance to the battery, and therefore a greater amount of amp travel of the same voltage potential, I don't know. But aluminium sulfate acts completely differently to ammonium sulfate, which acts completely different to magnesium sulfate. So I feel like I've barely scratched the surface, you know. Been researching it for about 10 years, experimenting for about 4 years of myself, and started doing the workshops about 2 years ago. The longest data that we have for both my battery conversions and the case studies are about 1.5 years at this rate. And it's like we've barely started. And like I said, this is just on sulfates. Imagine if you did this on phosphates and nitrates and and sulfides. There's so many potentials. And I think, not that I'm sure the lead acid battery doesn't particularly care whether we leave it behind or not, but just given that currently we have a worldwide infrastructure that is producing and distributing lead acid batteries, and of the amount of lead that must be already being recycled and returned to that system, you know, I saw an average that said that Exide now only mine they only have 30% input of new lead and new plastic products into the same total output per year of gross domestic product. So that means that 70% of their resources every year are coming through recycling of the lead and the plastic and the sulfuric acid that's already in circulation. Yeah. So I just think it is entirely feasible that there could be a change, even just a slight change. We're not talking about a massive change we're just talking about like a liquid change, really. A slight change to the chemistry could potentially mean that you could buy batteries off the shelf that last for decades. And I wonder if that would provide certainly an interim for off-grid storage that is, I'll answer just a sec, between like, you know, 10, 20, 30 years of lifespan at this point where we are between old school lead acid and moving away from a centralized grid system and into like Powerline and the NMC, NCA off-grid lithium cells. Yes?
I always thought part of the battery recycling was that they recycled the acid as well.
They do.
So have you thought of taking your acid somewhere, just pouring it into the sewer?
You mean like I said, we do we neutralize it as far as we can go, testing on pH, attempt to sort of remove lead out of it. But I would much more prefer to be able to take the whole tub, you know, lead included, to a HazChem company in place where they have all the infrastructure in place to do that. I think that would be a much smarter idea. What I have found, I only approached one place, I can't remember their name, in Camberwell, that were working with ChemWatch or HazChem, I can't remember the name. They basically were disinterested in working with myself and my team for that workshop because we weren't a business we weren't a battery recycling business. We weren't something they were going to form a contract with. And it was a shame because I think that would have been a much smarter idea. So that's why we ended up coming up with a solution, a solution at that time. It's certainly not the best solution. And I think that if there was if something like this was to be more available for homebrew kind of setup and for the you know, builders, engineers in the garage kind of mentality. They don't take sulfuric acid, I found out. So unless you just lie and you put it in a paint tin. One of the tricks that one of the guys who came to one of the workshops, he said that what he's been doing is just so he'll get lots of batteries anywhere he sees them on the side of the road, pick them up, and they're pretty much dry, you know, they've been sitting there. He just uses them to pour the lead sludge into and then takes them to the battery recyclers. Because he says the same thing, he figures they recycle it all anyway, so and I don't know why they didn't want to work with us in terms of just taking buckets of sulfuric acid at varying concentrations. But if anyone knows of a place that would work on a residential level or domestic level, please let me know because it would be really helpful. That's right. And I mean, I understand there's probably a whole world of issues, you know, like, because they're having to rely on labor. You'd think they'd test. I don't know.
I was just wondering whether the battery manufacturers thought about offering reconstituted batteries, because I mean they'd obviously have the ability to handle these fairly dangerous chemicals on a much greater scale. And it seemed to me that they could So
Yep.
we can buy a brand new battery, or we can buy a rejuvenated battery at maybe half the cost.
Yeah, it's a great question. I don't know. I mean, to my knowledge, what's that? There are the Renew and Reborn, Born Again, I think is the name of a, which is ironic. It's a name of a company that rejuvenate batteries, and are they in Campbellfield? Oh no, that's Battery Stop, isn't it? I know that guy. Oh, do they do the Born Again, Reborn ones? Ah, because I've seen that he sells the clear acrylic Telstra batteries, the old 70s batteries from Telecom. And they're very clean, you know. And I've seen that he's using the pulse de-sulphators, right? So there are little companies around that are doing that. I was more interested, sort of not so much in just entering a marketplace. That's why I thought, I'm not going to patent this. I have no interest in making money out of this. I'm far more interested in a world where it doesn't have lead acid batteries in rivers in India. So under a Creative Commons license and then workshopping to try to just see, has anyone else worked on this? Is there a collaboration of information? Is there anyone who's interested or in a position, you know, who either has worked with batteries in the past, has communication, that kind of thing, just to start a process of seeing whether or not it would be possible to utilize the current enormous lead acid infrastructure and create something that could last for decades and be an interim, even if at the least, be an interim off-grid storage battery between where we currently are and the shift towards better battery technology. It's no lie, like everyone would have to agree that there are obviously better battery technologies just over the horizon, you know, and I think we've just seen the beginning of it. So in the next 20 to 30 years, it would be unfathomable what the sort of energy density, watt-hour to kilo ratios would be, the nano-tubular style batteries, like all that stuff is definitely going to shift our entire way we think of batteries and even have a use for batteries at all in the kind of way that we think of them now. But that's not here today. And I think that there's too many environmental concerns at the moment in terms of the infrastructure we have and the mismanagement of our resources. Lithium ion, as great as they are, doesn't win out over that in any way. You know, like the mass open cut mining for lithium is just as tragic as coal production. You know, like it's in many ways just shifted a lot of the focus to a different industry. But there's still river pollution through cyanide runoff for synthesizing lithium, or, you know, out of like the bismuth and the lead in the ore and all that kind of stuff. So instead of kind of leaving a chemistry that could work really well behind and just say it's totally over and we're moving on to something that's the future, you know, it's better, I think that there's a place where this could be utilized. And if not by mass mainstream, if the commercial products want to move in a certain direction, that's fine. But I have certainly started working with permaculture groups and off-grid houses to start building very large off-grid lead-based battery systems for free. And that seems to be a catch. It's amazing when you write a workshop and you say, you know, 50 kilowatt hour lead acid battery system for free. You get 100 people. It's fascinating. It's amazing. And then you just talk about the process, and then they think that you're crazy. One guy asked me if it was my PhD that I did, which was brilliant. I just said no. I didn't actually, you know, sort of go into, maybe it should be someone's, like maybe someone out there wants to do that. So that's basically, I'll sort of leave it at that in terms of presenting information. Any other questions, I'm happy to answer or chit chat, and we can pick my brain further later. Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
I rode a bike here from Coburg and doesn't get a lift home.
Woo!
There's a headwind.
Nice.
Oh, great.
Awesome. Awesome. Okay. Sweet. Oh, I think he'd be right up for that. I can't imagine why he'd want to take.
Like Malcolm Turnbull and our Innovation Nation.
That's right.
Very true. It's part of innovation here, isn't it?
Mm.
On those. So I've let Dominic talk tonight because it's been very interesting. I mean, yes, it has been very interesting for everyone to hear about some of the work that he's doing, some of the achievements that he's done already on those, and what he's working on, and you know, where it could all be going.
Thank you.
It's been very interesting.
Thank you,
Dominic.
Paul. Thank you very much. Thank you
on
very much.
those. Yeah.
Oh, thank you.
And Dominic will be staying. Dominic will stay for some questions
Yes.
later on those.
Yeah,
so we
yeah,
have a cup of tea and things and that. So we've gone for a while tonight, so I'm not going to bother doing my presentation on those. I'll do it another night.
Sorry.
On those, unless you all want to on those. But you know, we've talked quite a bit on this tonight on those, and I can use that for another night on those, so that would be fine. That's what I'd rather do.
Oh, well, apologies. That wasn't. Yeah, but thank you very much for the conversation,
Go
guys.
ahead with that.
Thank you, Paul.
But we've pretty well covered it all tonight. So if you want to go to the tea room, we can then chat. And if people want to ask any more informal questions on those, they're welcome ahead to do that.
Thank you, Paul.
Thank you.
Apologies.